3 years ago, my parents stood in front of the Chicago Business Board and branded me a thief. They blacklisted me from every accounting firm in the city to protect their golden child. For 3 years, I could not get a single interview. I was a ghost. Then last week, I finally walked into the city's most ruthless investment firm. My sister was there screaming for the guards to throw me out. But the CEO did not look at her. He looked at me, slid a heavy wax-sealed envelope across the mahogany table, and said, "Your grandmother left this for you with strict instructions for the exact moment they finally backed you into a corner." Before I tell you how one envelope from beyond the grave helped me legally annihilate the family that destroyed my name, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to build your own justice, because the people who were supposed to protect you threw you to the wolves. My name is Claire, and I am 33 years old. Stepping into the towering glass and steel lobby of Sterling Vanguard felt like walking into the belly of the beast. Polished marble floors echoed with the sharp footsteps of Chicago's financial elite. For 36 months, I had been completely shut out of this high-stakes world. My parents, Thomas and Brenda, owned a prominent commercial real estate firm. When a massive sum of money mysteriously vanished from their operating accounts, they did not look for the real culprit. They looked at me, their own daughter, and the company's dedicated forensic accountant, and they served me up on a silver platter. They ruined my professional reputation with every employer in town, ensuring I could never work again. They thought they had buried me. They thought I would stay down. But here I was standing in the lobby of the very institution that currently held the financial leash on their rapidly sinking empire. I adjusted the cuffs of my simple tailored blazer. I had spent the last 3 years operating in the shadows, working under a pseudonym for offshore firms, meticulously tracking digital footprints and rebuilding my war chest. I knew exactly why I was at Sterling Vanguard today, but nobody else did. The receptionist at the front desk had barely glanced at me when I gave my name. She simply pointed toward the velvet rope waiting area reserved for high-profile clients. I sat down on a sleek leather sofa, my briefcase resting calmly on my lap. The air in the building was chilled, smelling faintly of expensive espresso and corporate ambition. I watched the digital floor indicator above the private executive elevator ticking downward. 10, 9, 8. I knew exactly who was inside that building today. I had tracked their schedules as closely as their stolen funds. The brass doors slid open. Out stepped my younger sister, Peyton. At 30 years old, she was the undisputed golden child of the family, the newly appointed vice president of a company she barely understood how to run. She was draped in a pristine white couture suit, a visual representation of the wealth she had illegally siphoned from the family business. Walking right beside her was her husband, Jamal. Jamal was 34, a brilliant, highly successful African-American corporate lawyer who prided himself on his immaculate reputation. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit and carried himself with the effortless arrogance of a man who always won his cases in court. They were walking briskly, discussing the multi-million-dollar loan restructure they had just begged for upstairs. They needed that capital desperately to save the family business from total collapse. Peyton was laughing at something Jamal said. Then her eyes scanned the wide lobby and landed directly on my face. Her laughter died instantly. She stopped dead in her tracks. Her manicured hand gripped Jamal's arm tightly. I remained perfectly still, watching the color drain from her face before it was quickly replaced by a flush of unadulterated rage. She marched toward my seating area, her designer heels clicking aggressively against the marble floor. Jamal followed close behind, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Well, isn't this pathetic?" Peyton hissed, her voice loud enough to turn the heads of two nearby security guards. "I knew you were desperate, Claire, but stalking financial firms to beg for a job. They do not hire known embezzlers here." I looked up at her, my expression completely neutral. "Hello, Peyton. It is nice to see the company is paying you well enough to afford that jacket. It looks incredibly expensive." Peyton's eyes flashed with venom. Do not speak to me like we are equals, she snapped. You are a thief. You brought shame to our parents, and you have absolutely no right to be sitting in this building. I am going to call security right now. Before she could wave the guards over, Jamal stepped forward, gently placing a restraining hand on his wife's shoulder. He looked at me with a deeply insulting, calculated pity. He adjusted his expensive watch and sighed heavily. Claire, let us be practical here, Jamal said, using the smooth tone he reserved for hostile witnesses. You are making a fool of yourself. Sterling Vanguard does rigorous background checks. The moment they see your history, you will be escorted out by the police. Do not subject yourself to that kind of public humiliation today. He reached into his wallet, pulled out a crisp $50 bill, holding it out. Take this, he said softly. Go get yourself a nice hot meal. Just leave quietly and preserve whatever shred of dignity you have left. I looked at the money hovering in the air. I did not blink. I did not flinch. I did not reach out. I simply let my eyes drift up to Jamal's perfectly composed face. I am certainly not here for charity. Jamal slowly lowered his hand, the $50 bill fluttering to the polished marble floor between us. He let out a condescending sigh, shaking his head as if dealing with a stubborn child. Peyton, however, completely lost whatever fragile composure she had maintained. Her face contorted with unchecked fury. She stepped directly into my personal space, her expensive perfume clashing with the bitter scent of her jealousy. She planted herself firmly in my path, throwing her arms out wide to physically block me from taking another step toward the reception desk. Are you deaf? Peyton shrieked, her voice echoing off the high glass ceilings of the lobby. Several executives paused their conversations to stare at the unfolding spectacle. I said you are not wanted here. You are a known thief. You stole from your own family. You embezzled $150,000 and everyone in this city knows it. Do not think you can slither your way into a reputable firm like Sterling Vanguard. I will personally make sure the hiring managers know exactly what kind of criminal they are dealing with today. Security guards began to converge on our location, their hands resting cautiously on their radios. Jamal finally realized the scene his wife was causing and reached out to grab her elbow, hissing at her to lower her voice. We are here to finalize a massive loan, Jamal muttered through gritted teeth, desperately trying to salvage his dignified professional image. Do not jeopardize our family business by throwing a tantrum in the lobby. But Peyton was too consumed by her desperate need to crush me. She pointed a trembling manicured finger right at my face, continuing her loud, unhinged tirade about my supposedly fraudulent past. I stood my ground, my expression completely unchanged. I did not need to defend myself against her fabricated accusations because the dynamic of the entire room was about to shift entirely. The soft chime of the private executive elevator echoed through the cavernous lobby. The heavy brass doors slid open with a quiet whoosh. A sudden, palpable hush fell over the surrounding crowd. The security guards immediately straightened their posture and stepped back. Out walked Nathaniel Pierce, the formidable chief executive officer of Sterling Vanguard. He was a man who commanded absolute authority without ever needing to raise his voice. Dressed in an immaculate navy suit, his silver hair perfectly styled, he projected raw, unfiltered power. He moved across the lobby with deliberate, predatory strides. His sharp eyes scanned the scene, taking in the hovering security guards, the frantic lawyer, the screaming woman in the white couture suit, and finally me. Jamal immediately puffed out his chest and smoothed his lapels, preparing to deploy his best corporate networking charm. He stepped forward with a practiced, bright smile, extending his hand toward the approaching CEO. Mr. Pierce Jamal began, his voice dripping with forced professional warmth. I am Jamal, and this is my wife Peyton. We were just upstairs discussing the loan restructure for our family real estate portfolio. I must apologize for the disturbance. We are simply dealing with a distressed family member who has a rather unfortunate criminal history. Nathaniel Pierce did not even break his stride. He completely ignored Jamal's outstretched hand, leaving the brilliant corporate lawyer hanging awkwardly in midair. He did not spare a single glance for Peyton, who was still fuming and breathing heavily. Instead, Nathaniel walked straight past them both. He stepped deliberately over the $50 bill Jamal had dropped on the marble floor, his polished leather shoe pressing it flat against the stone. He stopped directly in front of me. The imposing executive, a man who regularly decided the fate of billion-dollar corporations, offered me a warm, respectful smile that sent a shockwave of absolute confusion rippling through my sister and her husband. Ms. Claire Nathaniel said, his voice rich and resonant, carrying clearly across the quieted lobby. "It is an absolute honor to finally welcome you to Sterling Vanguard. We have been expecting you. Please follow me to the executive boardroom." Peyton let out a strangled gasp. Jamal physically recoiled, his eyes darting frantically between the CEO and my cheap blazer, his brilliant legal mind completely short-circuiting at the sight of my undeniable VIP treatment. I offered Nathaniel a slight nod of acknowledgement, gripped the handle of my briefcase, and followed him toward the private elevator. But Peyton was never one to accept defeat gracefully. Driven by a lifetime of unchecked entitlement and blind audacity, she broke away from Jamal's grasp. She ignored the warning shouts of the security guards and charged right past them, forcing her way onto the executive elevator just as the brass doors were sliding shut. Jamal lunged forward to stop her in sheer terror, but he was simply too late. The doors closed, trapping me, the CEO, and my furious sister in an uncomfortably tight space. Peyton immediately turned her wrath onto the billionaire. "Mr. Pierce, you are making a massive mistake," Peyton demanded, her chest heaving as the elevator ascended. "You cannot possibly hire this woman. She is a master manipulator. She drained our family company accounts. My parents have the police reports. If you give her access to your firm's finances, she will rob you blind. You need to listen to me before you ruin your own company." Nathaniel did not call security when the doors opened. He simply gestured for me to enter the sprawling mahogany boardroom. Peyton stomped in right behind us, crossing her arms defensively. Nathaniel calmly took his seat at the head of the table. He looked at me, ignoring Peyton, and reached inside his jacket. He pulled out a weathered envelope sealed with dark red wax. He slid it across the mahogany table until it rested in front of me. He traced his fingers over the aged parchment and read the handwritten inscription aloud, only to be given to Claire when they finally back her into a corner. The slanted, elegant cursive of my late grandmother Beatrice swam before my eyes. Seeing her familiar handwriting after so long was like stepping on a landmine. The heavy silence of the boardroom vanished instantly, replaced by the deafening echoes of the exact day my life was systematically dismantled. My mind violently jerked backward, plunging me into the memory of a rainy Tuesday morning 3 years ago. I stood in the opulent office of our family's commercial real estate firm. The air was thick with tension and the sharp smell of my father's expensive cigars. Spread across his desk were the financial reports I had stayed up for 3 consecutive nights to audit. I had found a massive, glaring hole in the operating account. Exactly $150,000 had been bled from the company over a 6-month period. As the lead accountant, it was my absolute duty to report the discrepancy. I had walked into that office with a color-coded binder, fully expecting my parents to launch an immediate internal investigation. I expected them to call the bank. I expected them to call the authorities. Instead, they locked the office door and turned on me. My father, Thomas, stood towering over his custom-imported desk, his face flushed with a terrifying manufactured rage. My mother, Brenda, sat perfectly poised on the tufted Italian leather sofa, refusing to even look at the documents I had painstakingly prepared. And standing right behind them, filing her nails with supreme boredom, was Peyton. I pointed desperately at the spreadsheets. "The anomalies are right here," I pleaded, tapping the highlighted rows of offshore transfers and phantom vendor invoices. "Look at the routing numbers. These are unauthorized distributions. Someone inside this building is authorizing dummy payments." My father slammed his fist down on the paperwork, shattering the heavy silence of the room. "You ungrateful wretch!" he bellowed, his voice vibrating with absolute contempt. "We gave you everything. We paid for your expensive education. We gave you a prestigious position in this firm, and this is how you repay us. You manufacture this ridiculous paper trail to cover your own tracks." I stood there, paralyzed, my brain struggling to process the sheer audacity of his accusation. "Cover my tracks," I whispered, the air leaving my lungs. "Dad, I am the one showing you the theft. Why would I steal the money and then hand you the evidence?" "Because you got sloppy," Brenda interjected coldly, her voice devoid of any maternal warmth. "You got sloppy, and now you are trying to frame the administrative staff. Peyton told us you had been acting suspiciously with the bank tokens all week." I whipped my head toward my sister. Peyton offered a tiny, triumphant smirk, her eyes glinting with malice before she quickly morphed her expression into one of deep, exaggerated sympathy. "It breaks my heart." Claire Peyton sighed, slowly shaking her head. "We trusted you with the family legacy." The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. They knew. They already knew exactly where the money had gone. They knew Peyton had siphoned the funds to sustain her reckless, luxury-obsessed lifestyle. But rather than hold their golden child accountable, rather than face the humiliation of Peyton going to federal prison, they had unilaterally decided to sacrifice me. I was the necessary casualty to protect their perfect corporate image. I pushed the heavy binder toward my father one last time. "Audit the accounts independently." I challenged, my voice shaking with rising fury. "Bring in an outside agency today. The digital footprints lead directly to Peyton. You know it." Thomas grabbed the binder and hurled it violently across the room. The pages scattered across the carpet like snow. "Do you think a fancy accounting degree lets you rob us blind? I will burn your reputation to the ground until you learn to respect this family." He kept his promise. They never pressed criminal charges, of course. Filing a police report would mean allowing actual detectives to execute a real forensic audit, and that would lead law enforcement straight to Peyton's offshore accounts. They could not risk the legal discovery process. But what they did was far more destructive than a quiet arrest. They utilized their extensive influence within the Chicago Business Board. My parents attended every gala, every networking dinner, and every real estate summit, playing the role of the heartbroken, betrayed founders. They whispered their toxic lies into the ears of every CEO, managing partner, and hiring director in the city. They claimed I was a brilliant but unstable rogue accountant who had maliciously exploited a family vulnerability. They told everyone that they had shown me mercy by not pressing charges, framing themselves as compassionate parents dealing with a troubled, thieving daughter. The corporate world is incredibly small, and rumors of financial fraud are a lethal poison. Within weeks, my name was entirely toxic. Job offers I had lined up were abruptly rescinded. Elite headhunters who used to relentlessly pursue my expertise suddenly stopped returning my calls. Security guards at top financial institutions were given my printed photograph and strictly instructed to turn me away at the lobby doors. I lost my apartment. I lost my professional network. I was completely isolated, cast out from the only city I had ever called home, forced to carry the crushing weight of a crime I had actually tried to stop. The brutal memory faded as quickly as it had surfaced, snapping me back to the cold, air-conditioned reality of the Sterling Vanguard executive boardroom. The faint scent of wax from the envelope grounded me. 3 years of living as a ghost, 3 years of swallowing the bitter injustice of their relentless slander, all led to this exact second in time. I looked across the mahogany table at Nathaniel Pierce, then let my gaze shift slowly to Peyton, who was still glaring at me, entirely oblivious to the absolute destruction that was about to unfold. Section 4. 1,000 words. Peyton thought my silence over the past 36 months meant I had surrendered. She assumed I was broken, weeping in some cheap apartment, crushed by the heavy weight of their orchestrated smear campaign. She was entirely wrong. There was absolutely no room for self-pity in my life. Pity is a useless emotion that pays zero dividends. When my parents effectively exiled me from the Chicago financial sector, I simply reinvented myself. I created an untraceable digital identity. Under a highly secure pseudonym, I contracted my forensic accounting services to offshore firms in Europe and Asia. Those international conglomerates did not care about the fabricated gossip circulating among Chicago real estate developers. They only cared that I possessed a lethal ability to dismantle complex financial structures and uncover hidden liabilities. I worked gruelingly long hours syncing my sleep schedule to Tokyo and London markets. My apartment became a fortress of absolute productivity. I lived incredibly frugally, banking 90% of my substantial international earnings. I needed a war chest, and I built one quietly, dollar by dollar, day after day. I refused to let the unfairness of my situation consume my energy. Every time the sting of my family throwing me away threatened to break my focus, I channeled that raw anger directly into my work. I became a machine processing international tax codes and corporate asset allocations with ruthless efficiency. The isolation they forced upon me became my greatest advantage. Without the distractions of a social life or family obligations, I was free to dedicate every waking moment to my ultimate goal. But my lucrative overseas contracts were merely the day job that funded my true objective. Every night when the rest of the city finally slept, I turned my attention back home. I unleashed my professional expertise entirely on my parents' company. Forensic accounting is not just about crunching numbers. It is about understanding human behavior through the cold, unforgiving lens of mathematics. People lie constantly, but money always leaves an indelible footprint. I treated my own family business exactly like a hostile corporate espionage target. I legally scraped every available public record, cross-referenced property tax filings, and meticulously monitored regional vendor registrations. I tracked the rapid creation of new limited liability companies connected to our family address. I built a massive digital war room on encrypted offshore servers, mapping out every single asset, every suspicious property acquisition, and every questionable vendor payment associated with Thomas and Brenda. It was meticulous, exhausting work that required absolute dedication. I sifted through endless digital breadcrumbs looking for the tiny microscopic anomalies that sloppy embezzlers always leave behind. Peyton was arrogant, which meant she was dangerously careless. She thought routing money through shell companies with generic names would permanently mask her activity. She did not realize that a skilled forensic auditor can easily pierce the corporate veil by tracking registered agent signatures and matching deposit dates directly to her aggressive spending habits. I traced funds moving from the primary company operating account into intermediate vendor accounts, which then conveniently wired monthly payments to obscure offshore trusts. I cross-checked the dates of these wire transfers against Peyton's social media posts. Whenever a large sum vanished from the corporate ledger, Peyton miraculously appeared online flaunting a new imported sports car or an exclusive luxury vacation. The correlation was mathematically undeniable. I gathered IP addresses, transaction timestamps, and digital authorizations, slowly weaving a web of irrefutable evidence. I was not just building a case. I was architecting a financial guillotine. What I uncovered during those countless sleepless nights completely shattered my understanding of the initial betrayal. The $150,000 I originally flagged 3 years ago was not a single isolated incident of theft. It was merely the tip of a massive rotting iceberg. The missing funds were part of a continuous systemic bleed that had been draining the company dry for years. Peyton had not just taken a one-time payout to cover a bad debt. She had established a recurring pipeline of gross embezzlement to fund a lifestyle she could never legally afford. Every luxury vacation, every designer handbag, every aggressive bid on premium real estate was financed by violently draining the lifeblood of our parents' company. And the most sickening realization was that Thomas and Brenda were fully aware of the hemorrhaging. They had watched the company accounts dwindle, actively choosing to subsidize Peyton's catastrophic greed while watching their own commercial empire slowly suffocate. They needed a scapegoat to explain the massive deficits to their investors and creditors. I was simply the most convenient target. They threw me under the bus to buy themselves time, hoping Peyton would eventually stop. But parasites never stop feeding until the host is entirely dead. That realization fueled my relentless pursuit. I compiled every wire transfer, every fraudulent invoice, every hidden asset into an impenetrable legal dossier. I had the absolute proof of their financial crimes, but I needed the leverage to force them into a reckoning. That leverage was currently resting inside the red wax-sealed envelope on the boardroom table, a ghost from the past ready to execute judgment. The weight of that truth kept me focused. The fire of their injustice burned cold inside me, transforming into analytical precision. I was no longer the frightened daughter desperately seeking approval. I was the architect of their impending destruction. Every spreadsheet I verified, every offshore account I decrypted brought me closer to clearing my name. They assumed my sudden silence was a sign of defeat, failing to recognize that silence is often the sound of a predator waiting. This digital evidence required physical authority to deploy effectively. I needed the final piece of the puzzle that Grandma Beatrice had hidden away. As I stared at the sealed envelope sitting between myself and Nathaniel Pierce, my mind violently shifted back to the nauseating events that occurred exactly 1 day prior. The trap was set. But to understand the true magnitude of the destruction I was about to unleash inside this boardroom, you have to understand exactly how the money moved. Forensic accounting is a beautiful, brutal science. It strips away the lies people tell themselves and exposes the undeniable truth of their actions. During my 3 years in exile, I did not just find the missing $150,000. I found everything. I tracked the capital as it bled out of my parents' corporate operating accounts and into a highly sophisticated maze of offshore entities. Peyton had utilized a web of blind trusts based in the Cayman Islands to wash the stolen funds. She thought the Caribbean secrecy laws would protect her. She assumed the international banking barriers would keep her financial crimes hidden forever. She vastly underestimated my capabilities. I systematically bypassed those barriers. Working with overseas firms had given me access to international financial registries and the specialized knowledge required to pierce shell companies. I traced the wire transfers from Chicago to Grand Cayman. I watched the stolen corporate revenue flow into a trust labeled under a generic alphanumeric code. From there, the money was funneled back into the United States through disguised vendor payments and fraudulent consulting fees. It was a classic money laundering operation, executed with the reckless arrogance of someone who believed they were untouchable. I pulled the digital string and watched the entire sweater unravel. The evidence clearly painted a grotesque picture of Peyton's daily reality. The stolen capital did not go toward investments or business development. It went directly into sustaining a fraudulent image of extreme wealth. I cross-referenced the incoming offshore wire transfers with her personal credit card statements, which I legally obtained through a shadow audit of the family holding company. The numbers matched perfectly. When a massive sum disappeared from my parents' real estate firm, Peyton suddenly paid off high-stakes debts at underground casinos. She possessed a severe gambling addiction that my parents ignored, choosing instead to fund her losses with company money rather than send her to a rehabilitation center. The financial hemorrhage did not stop at the casino doors. Peyton used the laundered cash to maintain her designer lifestyle, purchasing imported sports cars, bespoke jewelry, and front-row tickets to exclusive fashion shows. Every time she flaunted a new couture handbag on her social media accounts, I logged the exact corresponding deficit in our family business ledgers. But her most audacious theft was the roof over her head. Jamal, the brilliant corporate lawyer, prided himself on his impeccable financial standing. He believed the lavish down payment on their sprawling suburban mansion came from Peyton's executive bonuses. He had no idea his pristine real estate was secured entirely by stolen corporate funds. Peyton had washed the embezzled money through the Cayman trusts and presented it to her husband as clean, hard-earned capital. Jamal was legally bound to a massive asset purchased with criminal proceeds. He was completely oblivious to the fact that his wife had turned him into an unwitting accessory to federal fraud. The irony was staggering. A man who built his entire career on defending corporate entities from liability was currently sleeping in a bed bought with embezzled cash. I had mapped out every single transaction. I possessed a digital fortress containing 99% of the evidence required to send my sister to federal prison and leave my parents utterly bankrupt. I had the offshore routing numbers. I had the fraudulent invoices. I had the timestamps proving my parents authorized the transfers to cover Peyton's tracks after they publicly accused me of the initial theft. I had spent 36 months building a flawless, irrefutable case against the people who shared my blood. I knew every dirty secret they tried to bury. I knew the exact dollar amount of their catastrophic greed. Yet despite possessing an ocean of damning evidence, I was still missing the final crucial weapon. I needed the master key. I needed the ultimate legal authority to act on the evidence without being bogged down in years of litigation. I needed the power to execute judgment instantly, bypassing the courts and striking directly at the heart of their financial empire. That missing 1% was the only thing holding me back from pulling the trigger on my revenge. That missing 1% was currently resting right in front of me. I stared at the heavy red wax-sealed envelope sitting on the polished mahogany table of the Sterling Vanguard executive boardroom. Grandma Beatrice had always been the sharpest mind in our family. She built the real estate firm from the ground up, fighting tooth and nail in a male-dominated industry. She was a woman of iron will and absolute integrity. She had seen the rotting core of her son and daughter-in-law long before anyone else did. She knew Peyton was a parasite, and she knew Thomas and Brenda were too weak to stop her. Most importantly, Grandma Beatrice knew they would eventually try to destroy me. She had anticipated their betrayal years before it happened. She foresaw the exact moment they would back me into a corner and try to end my career. That was why she prepared this envelope. It contained the legal master key that would bridge the gap between my forensic evidence and unmitigated corporate control. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the cool air of the boardroom fill my lungs. Nathaniel Pierce watched me with quiet respect, waiting for my next move. Peyton glared at me with absolute hatred, completely unaware that her luxurious stolen life was seconds away from annihilation. I reached out and broke the wax seal. As the heavy red wax crumbled beneath my fingers, the sharp metallic snap echoed through the silent boardroom, pulling my mind away from the pristine glass table. The final trap was actually set exactly 24 hours earlier, standing on the manicured brick doorstep of my childhood home. The invitation had arrived via a highly unusual sweet text message from my mother, Brenda. She called it an olive branch dinner, claiming it was finally time to put the past behind us and heal as a family. I knew better. Toxic families do not offer olive branches, they offer bait. I parked my modest, reliable sedan at the very end of the sprawling circular driveway. My parents' suburban estate was a massive, sickeningly perfect display of wealth. It was a sprawling Tudor-style mansion wrapped in immaculate landscaping, featuring a heated driveway, custom gas lanterns, and a slate roof that cost more than most people earned in a decade. Looking at the towering brick facade, my stomach churned with a very specific clinical disgust. Outsiders saw a monument to hard work and commercial real estate success. But looking through the lens of a forensic accountant, I saw nothing but a crime scene. I knew exactly how many offshore wire transfers had paid for those imported Italian marble pillars. I knew which dummy vendor accounts had funded the lavish heated infinity pool in the backyard. The entire estate was dripping with expensive, completely unearned luxury, built on the rotting foundation of a dying company and purchased with the currency of my destroyed reputation. I approached the heavy oak front door, my posture perfectly straight, my facial expression locked into an impenetrable mask of absolute neutrality. I did not ring the bell. I simply turned the brass knob and stepped into the grand foyer. The air inside hit me immediately, a suffocating mixture of expensive catered food, heavy floral perfumes, and the sharp, unmistakable scent of my father Thomas, burning his premium imported cigars. I walked slowly toward the formal dining room, the sound of my sensible heels muffled by the thick hand-woven Persian rugs. Laughter drifted down the hallway, loud and utterly devoid of any genuine warmth. It was the sound of people celebrating a victory they had not actually won. I stepped into the archway of the dining room and took in the grotesque tableau. Thomas and Brenda were holding court at the head of a massive mahogany table, acting like royalty surveying their loyal subjects. The dining room was draped in an obscene amount of wealth. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over a table set with fine china and polished silver. At the center of it all sat Peyton, practically vibrating with smug, unchecked entitlement, and her husband Jamal, looking sharp, composed, and effortlessly superior in his custom-tailored evening wear. My father was in the middle of a grand gesture holding a bottle of vintage wine that easily cost more than my first car. He was pouring generous glasses for everyone, his face flushed with the arrogant flush of a man who believed he had just conquered the world. To the future, Thomas boomed, raising his crystal glass high into the air. To the continued expansion of our empire, and to Peyton and Jamal, who are about to secure the most pivotal financial partnership in the history of our company. Brenda clapped her hands together in performative delight, her wrists heavy with diamond bracelets that I knew for a fact were purchased 3 days after a massive fraudulent transfer from the corporate payroll account. "We are just so incredibly proud of you both," Brenda gushed, leaning over to kiss Peyton on the cheek. Securing a multi-million-dollar loan restructure from Vanguard Capital is no small feat. It takes real business acumen, it takes true vision. Peyton beamed, soaking up the unearned praise like a sponge. She swirled the expensive red wine in her glass, her eyes catching the light of the chandelier. "Well, it is all about knowing how to present the right numbers to the right people," Peyton said, her voice dripping with a sickly, sweet, false modesty. "Jamal deserves the credit, really. His legal team made sure our corporate portfolio looked absolutely flawless on paper. The underwriters at Vanguard Capital were incredibly impressed with our profit margins." I stood silently in the archway listening to this masterclass in delusion. Peyton was actively boasting about presenting doctored financial records to a major investment firm. She was bragging to her parents, the very people who enabled her embezzlement, while her husband sat right next to her, completely unaware that the flawless corporate portfolio his legal team had submitted was actually a fabricated house of cards. Jamal smiled proudly, adjusting the cuffs of his pristine shirt, taking credit for pushing through paperwork that would eventually make him an accessory to massive federal bank fraud. It was a stunning display of collective hubris. They were celebrating a financial rescue package that had not even been finalized yet, drunk on the illusion of their own invincibility. They genuinely believed that securing the massive Vanguard Capital loan would wipe their slate clean, covering the massive gaping deficits Peyton had created over the last 5 years. They thought the incoming capital would save their sinking ship, completely unaware that the iceberg was already tearing through their hull. I cleared my throat, a single sharp sound that immediately shattered the celebratory atmosphere. 4 heads snapped toward the archway simultaneously. The laughter died instantly. Thomas froze, the expensive wine bottle suspended in midair. Brenda's performative smile collapsed into a tight, nervous grimace. Jamal blinked, his lawyerly composure briefly slipping into genuine surprise, and Peyton simply glared, her eyes narrowing with immediate visceral hostility. "Hello, everyone," I said, stepping fully into the dining room, my voice calm, even, and entirely devoid of emotion. "I received the invitation for an olive branch dinner. I hope I am not interrupting the celebration here today." My father finally regained his grip on the wine bottle, his knuckles turning white against the glass. He did not invite me to sit. He did not offer me a glass of the vintage wine he was so proud of. Instead, he signaled to the empty chair at the very foot of the table, the seat farthest from his own position of authority. "Sit," he commanded, his voice devoid of any welcome. "We were just discussing how to handle your unfortunate predicament," Brenda added, her voice dropping into that saccharine, patronizing tone that used to make my skin crawl. She smoothed her silk napkin, giving me a look of deep performative sorrow. "We have been so worried about you, Claire. It has been 3 long years of silence, and frankly, it breaks my heart to see you drifting like this." I walked slowly toward the table, keeping my pace measured and deliberate. I took the seat at the foot of the table, feeling the weight of their combined stares. Peyton leaned back her chair, creaking a smug, satisfied smirk playing across her lips. She was clearly enjoying this. She loved watching me be reduced to the role of the wayward, disgraced daughter. I folded my hands on the table and waited. It was a power play, plain and simple. They wanted me to speak first. They wanted me to beg. I stayed silent, my face a mask of practiced indifference. The air in the room grew thick with the unspoken tension. Brenda could not handle the silence for more than a few seconds. She leaned forward, her diamond bracelets clinking against the fine china. "We have had many late-night conversations about you," she said, her eyes searching mine for any sign of weakness. "Your father and I, and even Peyton, have decided we want to help you. We are prepared to offer you a way back into the fold. This is a lifeline, Claire. We are not just going to abandon you to your own devices when you are clearly struggling." Struggling was a fascinating choice of words. They had spent 3 years ensuring I struggled, and now they were positioning themselves as the saviors who would rescue me from the very hole they had dug. Brenda gestured toward my father, who remained stone-faced. "We have an opening at the warehouse," she continued, her voice light, as if she were discussing a simple household chore. "It is a night shift position. Janitorial services. It is steady work, pays a modest wage, and it would allow you to pay off those debts you have accumulated since you left. Janitorial work." The audacity was so extreme it was almost impressive. They wanted me as senior forensic accountant to scrub the floors of the company I had helped build, the company I had been falsely accused of stealing from. I glanced at Peyton. She was barely containing her laughter, hiding a wicked smile behind her hand. "I am sure it would be a very humbling experience for you, Thomas," added his voice dripping with condescension. "You have spent years playing at being independent in California. It is time you learned what real work looks like. It is time you got your hands dirty and learned the value of $1. You have a chance to prove you are ready to be a part of this family again." I leaned back in my chair, holding their gaze one by one. I let the silence stretch for a full 10 seconds. I watched the discomfort begin to ripple through Brenda. Her practiced maternal mask started to slip, replaced by a nervous, twitchy energy. She needed me to respond. She needed me to accept the humiliation so they could cement their victory. "Just admit to the $150,000, Brenda whispered, leaning in closer, her voice thick with fake desperation. "Apologize to your sister for the trouble you caused her, and we can finally be a family again. We are offering you a lifeline, Claire. Take it. It is your only path back." My father nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing. "You have one chance to fix the damage you caused this company. Take the job, sign a confession statement, and we will wipe your slate clean." The absurdity was absolute. They were not just asking for my labor. They were demanding the total surrender of my truth. They wanted me to validate their lies and erase the reality of their corruption. I looked at the roast turkey, the untouched cranberry sauce, and the silver cutlery that had been used to celebrate my exclusion from my own inheritance. I thought about the thousands of hours I had spent in my tiny apartment, auditing their corruption, uncovering their fraud, and watching the shell companies grow. I thought about the envelope currently tucked inside my briefcase, a weapon they did not even know existed. They were offering me a janitor's rag, while I held the power to bring their entire world crashing down. I kept my face entirely blank. I did not shift in my chair. I did not blink. I simply stared at Brenda until she finally looked away, unable to sustain the intensity of my gaze. The silence in the dining room became suffocating. Peyton tapped her manicured nails on the table, the sound rhythmic and irritating. "What?" Peyton snapped. "Cat got your tongue. Are you too good to work for us now?" I finally stood up. I did not reach for the wine. I did not pick up the water glass. I just smoothed my blazer and looked down at my father. "You are worried about the company's future," I said, my voice cutting through the room like cold steel. "And you are worried about the debt you owe to Vanguard Capital. You think a janitor can clean up this mess? You are looking for a scapegoat just like you did 3 years ago. I am not a janitor, Dad, and I am certainly not the one who should be apologizing. I turned my gaze to Peyton. And you little sister, you have been very busy moving numbers around. Have you checked the offshore accounts today? Her smirk vanished instantly. Her face went ashen. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. Thomas shifted his wine glass, wobbling. What are you talking about? He demanded. But I did not answer. I just held their collective gaze, watching the fear ignite behind their eyes. Knowing the absurdity of their offer had just sealed their fate. The olive branch had been offered, but it was nothing but a burning torch. The sheer breathtaking arrogance of my sister was a sight to behold. While my father was still reeling from my refusal of his janitorial lifeline, Peyton decided it was the perfect time to pivot to total domination. She stood up from the table not to clear the plates but to perform. She walked around to where I was standing, her movements fluid and practiced, designed to maximize the visibility of her latest acquisitions. "Look at this," she said, thrusting her left wrist directly under my nose. She had twisted her arm so the overhead chandelier light caught the stones perfectly. "It is a new custom piece. 3 carats of flawless, brilliant cut diamonds." She laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "I am sure you have never seen anything of this caliber in your little bakery life." My parents watched, their eyes wide with that sickening indulgent pride. They were not even embarrassed by her blatant materialism. They were mesmerized by it. She didn't stop there. She leaned in close, her voice a condescending whisper that barely carried over the table. "I saw your car in the driveway, Claire. A rental Toyota. Seriously, I honestly did not know those were even on the market anymore. Is that what you drive to work every day? Or does the bakery provide a fleet of beat-up sedans for their staff?" She turned to Jamal, who was still trying to recover his composure. "Honey, tell her about the new portfolio expansion we are looking at. She needs to understand that some of us are playing a much bigger game." Jamal looked at me, his eyes flickering with a mix of pity and annoyance, but he remained silent, unwilling to fully engage in the friction Peyton was creating. He still thought I was just a bitter, broke sibling. He had no idea I was currently cataloging every stone on Peyton's bracelet as evidence of stolen corporate capital. Peyton didn't need the validation, but she craved it. She sat back down, sliding her chair aggressively close to the table. She pulled out her phone, opening a high-end investment app. "You know, since you studied accounting, you might actually appreciate this," she said, her tone dripping with mock academic interest. "I am moving my assets around. I have been taking advantage of these incredible offshore investment vehicles. They are so much more efficient than anything you were ever taught in school." She began scrolling through the interface, showing off a series of complex, opaque accounts that I immediately recognized as the shell companies I had spent 3 years dismantling. She was so blinded by her own ego that she felt the need to prove her financial intelligence to the sister she had successfully destroyed. The money she was throwing around was offensive. She boasted about a series of wire transfers she had authorized just yesterday. She mentioned specific account numbers, routing codes, and the names of the Cayman-based financial intermediaries I had already blacklisted in my own investigative notes. Every word she spoke was a confession. Every digit she recited was a time-stamped nail in her own coffin. I watched her memorizing the information, my face maintaining that same irritating, calm blankness. She interpreted my silence as defeat. She thought I was simply stunned by her worldly sophistication. She had no idea I was running a simultaneous forensic audit on her vanity. "You really should have stuck to the plan, Claire," she murmured, taking a sip of the vintage wine. "If you had just played by the rules, maybe you would have had a fraction of this. Instead, you are just an embittered, unemployed failure sitting in a house you do not own. Do you realize how embarrassing you are for us? I am sure my friends at the club find it hilarious that Thomas Wilson has one daughter running a multi-million-dollar real estate firm and another one playing with flour in a bakery." She was leaning over the table now, her face inches from mine, practically daring me to snap. I did not snap. I sat there, my hands folded, my breathing steady. I allowed her to dig her grave deeper with every word of her gloating. She detailed how she had moved funds out of the primary operating account to cover the latest bad real estate bet Thomas had made. She explicitly described the mechanism of the transfers, mocking the internal security measures as entirely outdated. "It is so easy," she scoffed. "You just have to know which accounts aren't monitored closely. Dad and Mom don't even look at the ledgers anymore. They just trust me to handle the growth. They know I have the magic touch." The arrogance was truly boundless. She was actively admitting to the embezzlement that had been pinned on me, believing I was too insignificant to ever report it. She assumed I lacked the standing to be believed even if I tried. She was right about one thing: she had the magic touch. She had the touch of a criminal who had never once faced a consequence. Her hubris was a blinding light, preventing her from seeing the trap she had walked into. I knew she was waiting for a reaction, a tear, a shout, anything to validate her superiority. I gave her nothing. I just watched her eyes, those beautiful empty eyes, as she bragged about the house she shared with Jamal. The down payment, she said, gesturing vaguely at her own neck and clothes, came from a very special investment strategy. Jamal doesn't even ask where it comes from anymore. He just knows that when I say, "We have the money, we have the money." Jamal shifted in his seat again, a flicker of genuine irritation crossing his face at her mention of him, but he stayed silent. He was the only one in the room who wasn't currently gloating. He was the one who was supposed to be the rational, legal mind. I wondered how he would react when he realized the money funding his lavish lifestyle was legally classified as stolen property. Peyton went on, detailing the offshore interest rates and the complex tax evasion strategies she had adopted, clearly thinking she was teaching me a lesson in superior financial management. She was holding the smoking gun, loading it, and handing it to me all at once. I mentally cross-referenced every company name, every bank code, and every date she spat out with the data I had downloaded into my briefcase in the other room. Everything matched perfectly. The timeline of the embezzlement, the scale of the theft, and the clear intent behind every fraudulent transaction. She was presenting the prosecution's entire opening statement on a silver platter, all because she couldn't resist the urge to feel powerful. It was the most satisfying, terrifying, and utterly predictable moment of my entire life. I knew then that the interview tomorrow at Sterling Vanguard would be the last mistake she would ever make. The dinner table conversation hit a deafening lull. Peyton had finished her gloating, her chest heaving with the exertion of her own self-importance. She looked around the table, waiting for the applause that she felt her financial dominance deserved. My mother was practically weeping with joy, clutching her pearls as if they were holy relics, while my father stared at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated disappointment. He still looked at me as if I were a stain on his perfectly polished reality. That was when Jamal decided it was time to step in. He stood up slowly, fixing his tie with a methodical precision that screamed institutional power. He was the picture of the high-powered corporate lawyer, a man who saw the world in terms of risk assessment, liability, and the brutal efficiency of the bottom line. He gestured for me to follow him, his movement a command I was expected to obey. I rose from the table, my expression remaining completely unreadable. We stepped into the quiet, dimly lit formal living room. The Christmas tree lights cast long, distorted shadows across the hardwood floor. Jamal didn't waste any time with pleasantries. He stood with his back to the fireplace, looking down at me with an expression of clinical detachment. He wasn't looking at me like a sister-in-law. He was looking at me like a malfunctioning asset that needed to be liquidated or repaired before it caused damage to his firm's quarterly projections. "Claire," he began, his voice smooth and devoid of any genuine empathy. "Let's operate on the level of professional reality for a moment. You are currently 33 years old, and you have spent 3 years wandering in the professional wilderness. You have no job, no standing, and your reputation in this city is essentially radioactive." He paced the small space, his leather shoes clicking against the floor. I watched him closely. He was using every intimidation tactic he had perfected in courtrooms, trying to rattle me with his aura of invincibility. Stubbornness in the eyes of the law, Claire, is not a virtue. It is a fatal defect. He stopped in front of me, leaning down slightly to emphasize his height. Peyton was incredibly gracious not to press criminal charges against you 3 years ago when the initial audit flagged the account. That was her choosing to protect the family instead of seeking justice. You are very lucky that she is a forgiving person. He made a dismissive gesture as if he were shooing away a fly. The sheer staggering hypocrisy nearly made me laugh, but I held it back. He was the one who had spent hours arguing with his partners about avoiding bad publicity for the firm. He knew exactly why they didn't press charges. It had nothing to do with forgiveness, and everything to do with protecting their own skin. Taking the janitorial job at the warehouse is the smartest move you could possibly make, he continued. It provides you with a baseline income. It allows you to start paying off those mounting personal debts, and most importantly, it stops this ridiculous, unfounded narrative you have been trying to push about the missing funds. He tilted his head, studying my reaction, as if waiting for me to break down in gratitude. It is a lifeline, Claire. It is an olive branch from people you have consistently disappointed. If you continue to refuse this, if you continue to show up at family events and make scenes about the past, you leave me no other choice. I have already drafted the initial language for a permanent cease and desist order. He paused, letting the threat hang heavy in the air. If I have to file it to keep you away from our property and to stop this slander against Peyton, I will do it without a second thought. My firm will ensure that you are legally barred from ever setting foot near this estate or our business premises again. Do you understand the professional fallout of that? It would be the final nail in your coffin. I stood there listening to him threaten me with legal action for the crime of existing while inconvenient. He was so confident in his logic, so entirely certain that I was the desperate, pathetic creature he and Peyton had spent years constructing in their minds. He thought he was playing a game of chess where he held every piece, unaware that I had already rewritten the rules of the entire match. I didn't tremble. I didn't look down at my shoes. I simply looked him directly in the eyes. I didn't need to remind him that his wife was a fraud, nor did I need to warn him that his own career was currently dangling by a thread of my forensic evidence. I wanted him to remain exactly this arrogant. I wanted him to feel absolutely invincible, right up until the moment his world collapsed. His condescension was the beautiful, necessary part of the process. Every arrogant syllable he uttered was adding another layer of ironclad intent to the case I was building. He walked toward the door, satisfied with his ultimatum, clearly believing that a few corporate buzzwords and a vague threat of litigation would be enough to break my spirit. He reached out and touched my shoulder in a final, patronizing pat. Think about it, Claire. Don't be the architect of your own final destruction. He walked back into the dining room to rejoin the celebration, leaving me alone in the dark living room with the crushing weight of his ignorance. I didn't feel small. I didn't feel broken. I felt the sharp, cold, exhilarating clarity of a woman who was about to dismantle an empire. I watched through the doorway as he returned to the table, and Peyton immediately leaned in to whisper something in his ear, probably mocking my reaction. They had no idea that they had just given me the final motive I needed to initiate the end of their story. The heavy oak door of the formal living room loomed behind Jamal as he walked away, his stride confident and punctuated by the sharp click of his heels. He was clearly pleased with himself, believing he had successfully deployed the final psychological hammer to keep me in my place. He moved back toward the dining room, his silhouette passing across the warm golden light of the chandelier. Peyton was already waiting for him, her face tilted toward him with an expression of performative adoration. I watched them both from the dim, cold periphery of the room. They were a perfectly curated team of deceivers, entirely comfortable in their shared delusion. I didn't need to chase them. I didn't need to beg. My moment of counterstrike had been prepared for over a year. I stood up, adjusting the fabric of my modest blazer. My heart wasn't racing anymore. It was beating with a steady, rhythmic, and cold precision. I had anticipated their mockery, their threats, and their casual cruelty. It was all part of the process of lulling them into a false sense of absolute security. I walked back toward the dining room, my movements calm and deliberate. The family was already settling back into their expensive meal, the wine flowing freely as they resumed their hollow celebration of unearned wealth. My mother laughed at a joke Gregory told, the sound jarringly bright in the tense air. I walked right past the table, pausing only for a heartbeat behind Jamal's chair. I leaned down just enough so that only he could hear me over the clinking of the silver cutlery against the fine china. I didn't yell. I didn't raise my voice to attract the attention of the table. I kept my tone soft, conversational, almost intimate. "You're a brilliant corporate lawyer, Jamal." I whispered, my breath barely ghosting over his ear. "It's no surprise that your reputation is built on airtight liability contracts and impeccable defense strategies." He froze his glass halfway to his lips. I could see his shoulder muscles tighten under his jacket. "But tell me," I continued, my voice smooth as silk, "have you ever actually audited your wife's personal accounts?" The reaction was instantaneous. Jamal didn't turn around immediately, but his grip on the crystal wine glass became white-knuckled. The playful, arrogant smirk that had been present on Peyton's face just seconds ago faltered, replaced by a sudden sharp flicker of genuine alarm. She had been listening, and she knew exactly which accounts I was referring to. Jamal finally turned his head, his eyes narrowing. "What are you implying, Claire?" His voice was no longer the smooth, confident defense attorney's pitch. It had gained a jagged defensive edge. I didn't wait for his clarification. I simply gave him a small, inscrutable smile. "Just a friendly tip from one accountant to another," I said, maintaining perfect eye contact with him until he was forced to look away. "Check the routing numbers on the last 3 major deposits. You might find the origin of that down payment on your house much less respectable than you currently believe." I didn't stay to watch the fallout. I didn't wait to see the frantic, silent panic that would surely erupt between them once I was out of earshot. I walked out of the house, my pace steady and my chin held high. The cold night air hit my face, refreshing and clean, a stark contrast to the stagnant, dishonest atmosphere I had just left behind. I walked past my rented Toyota and toward the driveway exit, without once looking back at the house that had been the stage for my upbringing. I had left my untouched dinner on the table, a symbolic gesture of the finality of this moment. I wasn't hungry for their bread. I was hungry for the truth. As I started the engine of my car, I checked the dashboard clock. The time was exactly 9:45 p.m. Tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., I would be walking into the boardroom of Sterling Vanguard. Tomorrow morning, their entire financial universe would cease to exist. Every lie they had told, every dollar they had stolen, and every person they had betrayed would come home to roost. Peyton thought she was holding all the cards, but she hadn't realized that the deck was mine all along. I pulled out of the driveway, the tires crunching softly on the frozen gravel. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, refusing to glance back at the mansion. I didn't feel lonely. I didn't feel like the discarded, outcast daughter anymore. I felt like the executioner arriving at the scaffold. The trap was perfectly positioned, baited with their own arrogance, and waiting to spring at the exact moment they felt most secure. I drove back toward the city, the dark highway stretching out before me like a promise of a new life. Tomorrow I wouldn't just be reclaiming my inheritance. I would be reclaiming my name, my reputation, and my future. I had spent 3 years in the shadow learning how to strike from the dark. Now the light was coming, and I was going to be the one holding the torch. I reached into my pocket and touched the cold metal of the flash drive containing the final forensic audit. They wanted to see the family failure. Tomorrow, they would see the woman who bought their entire future and turned it into my own. The boardroom air was thin, smelling of ozone and high stakes. Peyton was pacing the length of the table, her high heels clicking like rapid-fire gunfire against the polished wood. She was hyperventilating, her face a mask of distorted panic as she leaned toward Nathaniel Pierce. She demanded he eject me, her voice shrill and vibrating with an unhinged, frantic energy. "You cannot sit there and take this seriously," she yelled, stabbing a finger in my direction. "This is a setup. She has been planning this for years, rotting away in some basement while she obsessively fabricated these documents. If you have any respect for the reputation of Sterling Vanguard, you will have the security team drag her out of this building right now." Nathaniel Pierce didn't even blink. He remained a statue of pure, terrifying indifference. He watched her meltdown with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a particularly pathetic insect under a microscope. He didn't offer a single word of comfort, nor did he signal the security team waiting just outside the glass wall. I ignored her completely. My entire focus narrowed to the red wax seal sitting in front of me. It was a perfect circle of crimson impressed with the distinct seal of my grandmother's crest, a phoenix rising from ashes. It was a symbol of her resilience. Her final message to the family she knew was fundamentally broken. I looked up and met Nathaniel's eyes. He gave me a single infinitesimal nod. It was the signal. I broke the seal. The wax crumbled under my thumbnail, a dry, brittle sound that seemed to silence Peyton mid-scream. I pulled back the flap of the envelope and slid the contents onto the table. First came the bank statements dated exactly 6 years ago. They were not modern digital printouts. These were the original high-quality heavy stock papers with the authentic embossed watermark of the local city bank. They were documents I had only seen in my nightmares. My eyes scanned the lines verifying the account numbers and the massive unauthorized withdrawals that had effectively emptied the firm's emergency liquidity fund. Beside them were ledger notes handwritten by my grandmother in her distinct, sharp script. They were heavily redacted in some areas, but the margins were filled with brutal, unflinching observations about the financial incompetence of her own son Thomas and the manipulative, parasitic influence of his wife Brenda. She hadn't just suspected them, she had tracked them. She had mapped their slow, methodical destruction of her company with the precision of a surgeon. Finally, I pulled out the last document, a certificate of authorization for a blind trust. My hands remained steady, though my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The document was a legal masterwork. It was drafted and witnessed by the most prestigious law firm in the state, specifically designed to bypass the traditional inheritance laws that my father had planned to manipulate. It didn't just name me as a beneficiary. It granted me the irrevocable power to consolidate and oversee the entirety of the firm's regional assets. It was the ultimate final checkmate. Peyton lunged across the table, her claws reaching for the documents, her face twisted into a snarl of pure desperation. She was no longer trying to look professional. She was fighting for her survival. I anticipated her move, pulling the folder back just inches before her fingers could make contact. Nathaniel stood up, then his voice a low, gravelly rumble that stopped Peyton in her tracks. He moved with a speed that belied his age, placing his hand firmly on the folder to pin it to the table. "Do not touch those," Nathaniel said, his tone utterly devoid of warmth. "These are legal instruments filed with the court and the SEC. If you touch them, I will ensure the police add a charge of evidence tampering to the growing list of your crimes." Peyton's breath hitched in her throat. She looked at Nathaniel, her arrogance finally beginning to crack under the weight of the reality in front of her. She looked at the documents, then at the ledger notes, and then finally at me. I sat there, the light from the floor-to-ceiling windows behind me, casting my shadow across the entire table. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The silence in the room was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Every number on those bank statements was a piece of the trap that had been waiting for them for 6 years. Every ledger note was a brick in the wall I had built to enclose them. My father and mother were still pounding on the boardroom doors outside, their frantic shouts muffled by the soundproof glass. They had no idea that while they were screaming, the foundation of their entire existence was being legally dismantled inside. Peyton's eyes darted from the bank statements to the trust certificate, and the realization hit her with the force of a tidal wave. She wasn't just losing an inheritance, she was losing her freedom. She was losing the leverage she had used to control this family for her entire adult life. She looked at me, and for the first time, there was no gloating. There was no arrogance. There was only the raw, ugly, and undeniable fear of someone who had finally realized they had lost the only game that ever mattered. I looked down at the documents, feeling the cold, hard weight of Grandma Beatrice's final gift. The seal was broken, and there was absolutely no turning back now. The end of their story had officially begun. I cleared my throat, the sound sharp in the pristine silence of the boardroom. My eyes traveled to the letter accompanying the financial documents, Grandma Beatrice's handwriting, still as bold and uncompromising as the woman herself had been. I began to read aloud, my voice steady, projecting across the expansive mahogany table to the two people who had bankrupted their morality to fuel my sister's greed. To my dearest Claire, the letter began, written in that familiar slanted ink. If you are reading this, the time has come to stop hiding the rot. I have sat in this house for decades watching your father Thomas and Brenda play their pathetic games. They were never leaders. They were merely custodians of an empire they lacked the intelligence to manage and the integrity to preserve. They found it easier to build a life on the fragile illusion of perfection than to do the actual hard work of running a sustainable business. I watched Thomas's face redden. He opened his mouth to interrupt, but Nathaniel held up a hand, effectively silencing him. I continued reading, my tone clinical. They were terrified of the truth, terrified of their own inadequacy. But most of all, they were terrified of you, Claire. They knew from the moment you began your forensic studies that you would be the one to eventually expose them. You possessed the one thing they never had: a brain that demanded accountability. They knew that if you remained in control of the books, the house of cards they built for Peyton would collapse within a fiscal quarter. That is why they chose to destroy you first. They needed a scapegoat. They needed someone with your skills to hold the bag for the theft they had already committed. The letter detailed the exact methodology of their enabling. It was a step-by-step confession of their sins. Beatrice had documented their secret board meetings held in the middle of the night, where Thomas and Brenda signed off on unauthorized withdrawals. She detailed how they coached Peyton to lie to external auditors, creating a culture of deceit that they called business strategy. She had even recorded instances where Brenda would purposefully misplace my original ledgers, forcing me to work from corrupted, outdated copies that made me appear negligent. The depth of their betrayal was worse than I had imagined. They hadn't just looked the other way. They were the primary architects of the crime. It was all laid out in terrifying detail. The letter exposed how they had gaslighted me for years, systematically eroding my self-confidence until I was too exhausted to fight back. They made me feel like the incompetent one, the failure who couldn't balance a simple spreadsheet, while they were actively sabotaging my work to ensure I would be blamed for the mounting deficits. Beatrice had seen it all from her sunroom. She had watched my mother Brenda whispering poison about me to every influential person in the city, ensuring my career was crippled before it could even fully begin. She had watched my father Thomas authorize transfers, knowing fully well that his daughter Claire would be the one the authorities came for when the math finally stopped adding up. The letter took a turn, the tone becoming fiercely protective. I have spent these last few years quietly diverting funds from the family's primary operating accounts into a separate blind trust, Beatrice had written. Your father thinks he is the master of this firm, but he is a puppet. He has been dancing to the tune of the debt I allowed him to accumulate. I have been orchestrating the decline of this family business to provide the exact lesson they were too arrogant to learn. They will lose everything, Claire, and when they hit the bottom, they will come crawling to you. Do not give them a single penny. Do not offer them your mercy. They traded your life for their image. They deserve nothing less than the ruin they manufactured for you. Peyton looked as if she were going to vomit. Her hands were gripping her hair, her knuckles white, and her eyes were darting around the room, desperately looking for an exit that didn't exist. She had thought she was the smartest person in the room, the one who manipulated the system to get everything she wanted. Now she was staring at the undeniable proof that her entire existence had been orchestrated by the very grandmother she thought she had outsmarted. My mother. Brenda had stopped crying. She was sitting perfectly still, her face drained of all color, staring at the documents as if they were a death warrant. The weight of her own complicity was clearly pressing down on her, leaving her unable to even construct a lie. I finished the final paragraph, my voice barely above a whisper. Your grandmother knows your worth, Claire. She knew it when everyone else tried to make you small. This empire is yours now, and the truth is the final piece of the puzzle. I set the letter down on the table. The boardroom was silent, the kind of silence that precedes a total collapse. Nathaniel Pierce finally leaned back in his chair, looking at Thomas and Brenda with cold, calculating eyes. It seems the audit is complete, Nathaniel said, his voice deceptively calm. And it seems your primary shareholder has some questions for you regarding the last 6 years of corporate fraud. He stood up, signaling for the security team to finally enter the room. The game was over. The trap had closed. And for the first time in 3 years, the power in the room rested entirely in my hands. I watched them crumble, a family built on lies, now facing the terrifying, irreversible reality of the truth. The boardroom was bathed in an oppressive clinical light that made the gold cufflinks on Thomas's wrists look like cheap plastic toys. He was still sputtering, his face transitioning from a sickly pale to a deep, dangerous purple as he tried to wrap his mind around the financial apocalypse unfolding in front of him. You sold the company, he barked, his voice cracking with sheer, unadulterated shock. You sold our legacy to these wolves. Nathaniel didn't even flinch at the insult. He reached into his own sleek leather briefcase and produced a single thick document. It was a transfer of ownership agreement, signed, sealed, and stamped with the state seal of incorporation. Beatrice didn't just sell the family business to us, Thomas Nathaniel explained with a bored, sharp tone. She executed a hostile takeover from the inside years before you even knew the company was being liquidated. My grandmother was not a woman who believed in accidents or coincidences. She knew that if she simply left the company to Thomas and Brenda, they would treat it like an infinite piggy bank to fund Peyton's toxic habits until there was nothing left but dust. She had seen the future 6 years ago, and she decided to burn the bridge herself. The deal was complex and brilliant. Beatrice had surrendered the true controlling shares of Wilson Manufacturing to Sterling Vanguard in a private high-stakes trade. In return, she hadn't taken cash. She had negotiated for something infinitely more powerful. She had secured 51% of Sterling Vanguard's entire regional private equity division, placing it inside a specialized blind trust. This trust was the crown jewel of her strategic planning. It was designed with a specific singular contingency. It would remain locked, invisible to every audit and financial tracker until a specific trigger was met. That trigger wasn't her death as the family had assumed. The trigger was the exact moment Claire was summoned to the Sterling Vanguard corporate offices. The entire arrangement had been waiting in a digital vault for 6 years, silently gathering dividends and growing in influence. The moment I walked through the security sensors in the lobby this morning, the trust had legally uncoupled and attached itself to my personal assets. I wasn't here for a senior analyst position. I wasn't here to be vetted by an HR department. I was here to be formally recognized as the majority shareholder of the division that currently held the notes on every single one of my father's outstanding business loans. Peyton collapsed into one of the ergonomic office chairs, her face buried in her hands. The reality of the power shift was too massive to comprehend. She had been playing for pocket change while I had been sitting on the keys to the kingdom. My father looked as though he were having a medical emergency, his gaze flickering wildly from Nathaniel to me, desperately searching for a loophole, a mistake, a reason why this couldn't be happening. But there were no mistakes. The legal language was absolute, drafted by the finest minds in Chicago, and solidified by Beatrice's ironclad will. I stood up slowly. I walked to the head of the table, the very chair that Thomas had occupied for over 2 decades. I didn't sit yet. I just ran my hand along the cool, dark grain of the mahogany. It felt remarkably solid beneath my touch. This was the chair from which my father had lectured me on my worthlessness. This was the chair where he had decided my career was just a hobby, and now it was the chair from which I would dictate the fate of their entire existence. I felt a surge of cold electric satisfaction. The irony was perfect. They had tried to break me, they had tried to erase me, and in doing so, they had forced me to build a foundation so solid that they couldn't even dent it. Nathaniel Pierce remained standing, maintaining a respectful distance, acknowledging that the balance of power had officially flipped. He turned to me, his demeanor entirely shifted from that of a CEO to that of a lieutenant waiting for his commander's first order. The board members who had previously been only interested in Peyton's loan application now sat in absolute terrified silence. They were staring at me not as the disgraced accountant, but as the woman who could single-handedly fire every one of them by the end of the business day. I finally sat down. The chair was comfortable. It was perfectly positioned to give me a view of the entire room, and I leaned back, resting my elbows on the armrests. I looked at Peyton, who was still trembling, and then at Thomas, who looked like a man watching his life being dismantled in real time. My father started to speak, a stuttering, desperate attempt at an apology, but I held up my hand. "Not today, Thomas," I said, my voice steady, devoid of the fear I had carried for years. "We aren't here to talk about the past. We are here to talk about your liquidation." Nathaniel bowed his head slightly, his eyes never leaving mine. He knew exactly what I wanted. He knew that I had spent years analyzing every error, every fraud, and every misstep they had taken. "Welcome to your empire, Ms. Clare," he said, his voice quiet, carrying an undertone of genuine professional respect. I looked at the folder of documents, then back at my family. The game was over. They were no longer the predators. They were the prey. And I had absolutely no intention of being merciful. Peyton's eyes darted wildly, reflecting the sheer, jagged shards of her shattered reality. The absolute silence of the boardroom was punctured by her ragged, uneven breathing. Her mind was short-circuiting, trapped in a loop of denial and desperation. She couldn't process the legal reality that her father's power was gone. She couldn't process that the woman she had spent 3 years mocking was now her master. Without warning, she lunged across the polished table. Her fingernails, sharp and manicured, clawed at the air as she swiped for the trust certificate, her face twisted into a mask of feral rage. She wanted to rip the documents to shreds, believing that if the paper ceased to exist, the truth would vanish with it. "This is a fraud," she screamed, the sound echoing off the walls like a wounded animal. "You stole this. You forged everything. This is all a sick, twisted game." Nathaniel Pierce didn't even flinch. He remained perfectly still. His eyes locked on mine as if Peyton's tantrum were merely background noise in a quiet library. Peyton scrambled to retrieve her phone from her clutch, her hands shaking so violently she nearly dropped it twice. She began frantically dialing Thomas and Brenda, her thumb hitting the screen with trembling force. "Answer the phone, you old fool. Answer the phone," she hissed into the device. "Mom, get down here. Claire is here. She's trying to steal the company. She's using fake documents. She's threatening us." Her voice was high, frantic, and desperate, the sound of a predator realizing it had become the prey. She paced the room, the heels of her expensive shoes clicking against the hardwood, shouting instructions and threats into the speakerphone. I remained in my chair, my posture relaxed, observing the spectacular collapse of my sister's ego. It took less than 10 minutes for the heavy mahogany doors of the boardroom to fly open. Thomas and Brenda burst into the room, their faces vibrant with a deep, choleric red that matched the curtains. They were completely oblivious to the tectonic shift in power that had just occurred in the last hour. Thomas marched toward me, his index finger raised in a classic gesture of patriarchal dominance. Brenda followed right behind him, her eyes scanning the room for an ally, her expression ready to deliver a scathing lecture on family respect and professional conduct. I didn't stand up. I didn't even look away from the digital readout of the company's assets on the main display screen. Thomas didn't wait for an invitation. He stopped right in front of me, his chest heaving. "We have heard the nonsense Peyton is shouting about," Thomas barked, his voice booming through the room. "I don't know what kind of cheap trick you're attempting to pull with this firm, Claire, but it stops right now. We are going to have you escorted out of this building before you do any further damage to our reputation." He reached for his phone, his thumb hovering over the keypad. "I am calling the police," he declared, his confidence bolstered by the sheer habit of commanding a room. "I am filing charges for corporate espionage and harassment. This ends today. You are a disgrace to this family," Brenda added, her voice dripping with the familiar poison of her disappointment. "We tried to give you a job. We tried to offer you a way back into our lives, and this is how you repay us. By trying to sabotage your sister's biggest deal." They were standing in front of the man who effectively owned their livelihood, barking orders as if they were still the titans of the industry. They hadn't noticed the way Nathaniel had shifted his chair away from them, or the way he had exchanged a knowing, weary glance with his board members. They were performing their usual act of authority, completely blind to the fact that the stage had been sold out from under them. I let them finish their tirade. I watched the spit fly from my father's mouth as he threatened my liberty. I let them paint themselves into the corner of legal liability. Every threat they made, every accusation they leveled, and every attempt to physically intimidate me was only adding more weight to the mountain of evidence against them. When they finally paused to catch their breath, I stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, and undeniably confident. I walked around the end of the table and stood directly in front of Thomas. The office security detail, which usually responded to Thomas's beck and call, stood motionless by the door, waiting for my signal, not his. Thomas looked confused by the lack of response from the guards. He turned to bark another order, but stopped when he noticed the guard's attention was focused on me, not on his outburst. I opened the folder one last time, turning it to face them, so they could see the red seal of the trust certificate. "Dad, you aren't calling the police?" I said, my voice cutting through his sputtering rage like a blade. "Because if you do, you'll be handing them the keys to your own jail cell. You're threatening to file charges for espionage while standing in a room you no longer own in a company whose debt is held by the person you just tried to threaten." The look on his face was a portrait of confusion, then terror, as the implications began to sink into his mind. He finally looked at Nathaniel Pierce, who was slowly standing up, preparing to break the news that would finally silence them. My father's hand dropped, his phone slipping from his fingers to land softly on the carpet. The boardroom was no longer a place of family discussion. It was the scene of their final defeat. I didn't offer my father a second to regain his composure. I stepped toward the sleek control panel built into the mahogany table, my movements fluid and devoid of hesitation. With a single tap, the massive projector screen behind the CEO flickered to life. The high-definition display illuminated the entire room, casting a clinical blue-white light over the faces of my family. They looked smaller now, trapped in the harsh glare of the evidence. I didn't shout. I didn't need to. I had spent 3 years preparing for this moment of absolute, undeniable clarity. My laptop hummed as I navigated to a secure, password-protected folder labeled Audit Trail. I clicked open the first slide and the room grew colder. Before them sat the central ledger of Wilson Manufacturing, the very document that had been used to frame me 3 years ago. I toggled a filter, removing the layers of intentional obfuscation and confusion. What remained was the raw, brutal truth. I pointed to the first row of entries, the original missing $150,000. The numbers stood out like a fresh wound. I traced the wire transfers back to their source, then forward to their destination. I didn't tell a story. I simply let the numbers dictate the narrative. "Look closely, Thomas," I said, my voice cutting through the silence. "This is the exact amount you accused me of stealing in front of the entire business board." I showed the digital trail. Every cent was transferred directly to a shell company called Apex Holdings, registered under a residential address in the suburbs. I zoomed in on the signature. The digital authorization signature was a perfect pixel-for-pixel match of Peyton's official company clearance key. Peyton tried to speak, her throat clicking, but she had nothing to say. I moved to the next slide, revealing a detailed graph of recurring monthly transfers. This wasn't a one-time error. It was a rhythmic, systematic, and intentional bleed. I displayed the metadata. Every single transaction was tagged with an internal IP address. I dragged the cursor over the metadata tags, expanding the data to reveal the physical location of the device that authorized the payments. The map on the screen pinged with a bright red dot, showing the exact location of the family estate, specifically the guest wing, Peyton's bedroom. I didn't need to scream that she was guilty. The geographical data was screaming it for me. It was a digital fingerprint that tied her directly to every cent that had left the company accounts. I continued through the dossier, bearing every layer of her corruption. I showcased the fabricated vendor invoices. I pulled up the emails where Peyton had instructed the administrative staff to process payments for services that were never rendered. The screen was filled with evidence of her blatant disregard for corporate protocol. She had used the company as a personal slush fund for half a decade. I paused on a slide that itemized her most egregious purchases: a $60,000 payment to a high-end fashion house in Milan, a $50,000 debt settlement at an underground casino that only accepted offshore cryptocurrency payments. Each entry was a calculated stab at the integrity of the business my grandfather had spent his entire life building. The silence in the boardroom was heavy, suffocating. I switched the view to a side-by-side comparison. On the left, my original audit findings from 3 years ago, the very ones they had thrown in my face and labeled as fabrications. On the right, the verified bank-certified records showing that those original findings were 100% accurate. I turned to look at my mother. Brenda was shaking. She had realized that the evidence wasn't just proof of Peyton's crimes, it was proof of her own complicity. I opened the folder containing the email correspondence I had recovered from the company servers. "These were the emails sent to you, Dad," I said, pointing to a thread dated 2 years prior to my firing. "I had sent you an official request for an internal audit because I noticed these discrepancies early. Your response was to tell me to focus on my job and stop questioning your leadership." I scrolled through the thread. It was all there. My warnings, my attempts to bring this to their attention, and their blatant, aggressive dismissals. They didn't just ignore the theft, they nurtured it. They chose to let the cancer grow because they were more terrified of Peyton failing than they were of the company collapsing. It was a systematic cover-up, and the projector screen proved it beyond any reasonable doubt. I stopped on the final slide of the forensic report. It was a summary of the total loss calculated with compound interest and forensic accounting penalties, reaching well over $800,000. I looked at my father, who was staring at the screen as if it were a monster that had come to life. "Your reputation isn't being ruined because of me, Thomas. It is being ruined by your own pathological need to protect a thief. You handed your company to a parasite, and now that the host is dead, you're surprised there's nothing left to consume." I didn't move. I waited for them to deny it. I waited for one last lie. But looking at the screen and seeing their own signatures under Peyton's fraudulent authorizations, even they couldn't find the words. The forensic evidence had dismantled their world, and they were finally painfully looking at the wreckage they had caused. I didn't let them retreat into the comfort of ignorance. I clicked the remote and the screen transitioned to a new graphic, a stark visualization of the financial rot. I zoomed in on the transactions involving the luxury car dealership. The payments were structured to bypass standard oversight, appearing as mundane equipment maintenance fees. But the vehicle identification number associated with the payments matched a high-end European convertible parked in Peyton's driveway. Peyton tried to look away, but the screen was too bright, too clinical and inescapable. I highlighted the boutique receipts next. These weren't just random purchases, they were systematic drains on the operating capital. I brought up a list of digital receipts from a private shopping service in Paris. The billing address was listed as the corporate headquarters of our family firm, disguised as office furniture procurement. It was absurdly easy to track once you knew exactly where to look. Peyton had been buying handbags that cost more than the average American's annual salary using the company's payroll funds. The offshore wire transfers were the final piece of the forensic puzzle. I displayed a map of the globe with glowing red lines originating from our Chicago headquarters and terminating in a cluster of financial institutions within the Cayman Islands. I meticulously pointed out how these transfers aligned perfectly with the days Peyton took off for her unannounced extended vacations. It wasn't coincidence. It was a lifestyle being funded in real time by the very company Thomas and Brenda were allegedly leading. The board members of Sterling Vanguard, who initially held a posture of corporate detachment, were now leaning forward, their eyes locked on the screen. The sheer scale of the embezzlement was enough to ruin the reputation of anyone associated with the firm, and my father was sitting at the center of that fire. Then I pivoted to the most agonizing part of the presentation. The emails that proved my parents were not just victims of Peyton's greed, but active accomplices in my framing. I navigated to a folder I had labeled the cover-up. I clicked on a message thread from 3 years ago. It was an email from our father Thomas to Brenda, written 2 days after the missing $150,000 was first identified by the internal audit system. My breath hitched, but I didn't let the emotion cloud my presentation. I read the email aloud to the room. The text was brutal in its directness. Thomas had written that Peyton's embezzlement was already discovered, but that if the police were involved, the public fallout would destroy the firm's credibility before the next fiscal year. His conclusion was chilling. We need a scapegoat who has the credentials to look guilty on paper. Claire is the accountant. We can doctor the logs to point to her access tokens. It's the only way to save the firm and Peyton's future. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bones. Brenda had replied to that email with a brief, terrifying affirmation. Whatever keeps the family name intact is the right path. Do what you have to do. I looked up from the screen. My father was clutching the arms of his chair, his face a ghostly shade of gray. My mother was covering her mouth, her eyes fixed on the floor, unable to bear the weight of the evidence projected in high definition. They had known. They had sat across from me 3 years ago, watched me plead my case, watched me point out the errors, and they had consciously chosen to destroy me to keep their golden child out of federal prison. Peyton was no longer screaming. She was staring at her father with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. She hadn't realized her parents had left a digital record of their decision to frame me. She had assumed their conspiracy was just a verbal agreement, a secret pact that would die with the passing of time. She didn't understand the nature of forensic accounting. Once a digital path is created, it never truly disappears. I had spent 3 years recovering deleted server logs and restoring backups from the firm's old backup drives, finding these messages buried in the deep archives. I scrolled to the next document, a legal advisory memo from a private law firm that my father had consulted before the police arrived. The memo outlined the exact risks of reporting the theft. It warned that an external audit would likely expose Peyton's role in the embezzlement. The parents had ignored the memo, opting instead to proceed with the internal framing of me. It was all there. Every deliberate lie. Every conscious decision to ruin their own daughter's life to protect Peyton's comfort. I saw my mother's shoulders start to shake. She wasn't crying for me. She wasn't crying because she felt remorse for what they had put me through for 3 years. She was crying because she realized that for the first time, her image, her carefully crafted, pristine suburban image, was being incinerated before a panel of billionaire investors. Thomas tried to stand, perhaps to grab my laptop, perhaps to lash out. But Nathaniel Pierce signaled to the security guards. They stepped forward, blocking him from even moving a muscle. "You are finished, Thomas," Nathaniel said, his voice quiet, carrying the finality of a judge's gavel. "You have violated every fiduciary obligation you had to this company, to your investors, and to your daughter." He looked at me, a flicker of genuine respect in his cold eyes. "Ms. Claire, you have provided the most thorough and devastating audit I have ever witnessed in my career as a financier. You have done more than clear your name. You have demonstrated the kind of vision and moral fortitude that this firm prides itself on. I looked back at the screen at the map of the offshore money and then at my parents. They were still sitting in horrified, suffocating silence. Peyton was slumped in her chair, her white suit jacket stained with the sweat of her panic. They had reached the point where no amount of money, no amount of influence, and no amount of lying could save them. The 3 years of exile, the nights of working in the dark, and the calculated risk of this moment had paid off. The truth was out, the paper trail was verified, and the people who tried to burn my life down were now watching their own lives turn to ash. I closed the laptop, the screen going black, leaving us all in the heavy, truth-filled air of the boardroom. Jamal stood frozen, his eyes riveted to the cascading data on the projection screen. As a high-stakes corporate attorney, he possessed a mind that naturally organized chaos into linear, enforceable logic. He didn't see the drama or the family tears. He saw the incriminating paper trail. The offshore wire transfers I had uncovered weren't just abstract numbers. They were documented transactions flowing directly into the private accounts he shared with Peyton. He realized with a jarring absolute clarity that his own bank statements were now Exhibits A through Z in a federal embezzlement trial. His hands, usually so steady when navigating hostile depositions, began to tremble. He took a single shaky step back from the table, his mouth slightly ajar, as he processed the legal implications. He wasn't just married to a thief, he was legally entangled with a criminal syndicate. The realization hit him with the weight of a lead brick. Every luxury asset he owned, every dollar he had invested in their shared name, was now tainted by the stench of stolen corporate capital. He looked at the offshore account numbers that Peyton had so arrogantly bragged about, realizing they were the very accounts used to wash the money. He wasn't an innocent spouse, he was an accessory. He had signed the joint tax filings. He had benefited from the lifestyle. His career, his partnership at the firm, his social status in Chicago, it was all going to be dismantled by the federal authorities the moment this dossier hit a prosecutor's desk. The sheer mathematical certainty of his ruin became clear to him in the silence of the boardroom. Peyton, still oblivious to the legal death sentence her husband had just read, crawled toward him across the thick carpet. She looked up at him, her face a mess of mascara and desperation, her voice a shrill, frantic whine. "Jamal, you have to do something!" she sobbed, clutching the fabric of his perfectly pressed trousers. "Sue her! Use your firm! Use your connections, protect me from this!" She was shaking her fingers, digging into his expensive suit as she begged him to play the role of the savior. She thought she was pleading with her partner, her defender, her husband. She didn't realize that in Jamal's world, there was no room for loyalty to a sinking vessel. The transformation in Jamal was instantaneous. He looked down at her not with love, not with sympathy, but with the cold, calculating disdain of an attorney looking at a losing case file. He didn't comfort her. He didn't pull her into his arms to shield her from the truth. He looked at her hands on his clothing as if they were a contaminant he needed to shed. He violently yanked his arm away, the force of his movement causing Peyton to stumble backward and land hard on the floor. He stepped over her as if she were nothing more than an obstacle in his path. He smoothed the creases on his suit jacket and straightened his tie with a meticulous, rhythmic motion that felt chillingly efficient. He turned his back on his wife completely. He directed his entire focus toward me, his expression transitioning from panic to a terrifying, hollow professional respect. He looked at me as he would a rival counsel who had just beaten him with a superior strategy. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't try to negotiate. He simply analyzed the situation and made his move to survive. "I am a corporate lawyer, Peyton," he said, his voice clipped and devoid of any human warmth, not even bothering to look down at her as she sat sobbing on the carpet. "The first rule I learned was to never go down with a sinking ship." He turned his attention to me, his eyes sharp and analytical. The boardroom air felt electric as he addressed me. "Claire, the dossier you have compiled is masterfully structured. It is quite clear that you have been meticulous with your evidence collection. I have no intention of tethering my firm or my personal bar license to the crimes Peyton has committed." He pulled a business card from his pocket and placed it on the table between us. I am officially dissociating myself from her interest. May I request a copy of this dossier for my divorce attorney? He didn't wait for my verbal confirmation. He didn't look at Peyton, who had stopped screaming and was now staring at him in utter, paralyzed disbelief. He had effectively cut the last tie, severed the marital bond, and committed himself to the side of the prosecution before the investigation had even officially begun. Jamal walked towards the boardroom door with the same steady, arrogant gait he had entered with. He didn't spare a second look for the family that had raised him, nor for the woman he had pledged his life to. He reached the door, opened it, and didn't even look back as he stepped out into the hallway, leaving the echoing silence of the room behind him. Peyton let out a sharp, jagged sound that started as a wail and ended in a dry, painful heave. She was still sitting on the floor, the reality of her husband's desertion finally sinking in. She had lost her father's empire, she had lost her parents' respect, and now she had lost her only partner in crime. She was truly, completely alone. I watched her for a moment, waiting for a spark of humanity, but found none. She was just another piece of wreckage. I turned back to Nathaniel and prepared for the final act of this corporate execution. The departure of Jamal left a vacuum in the room that was almost physically painful. Peyton was still huddled on the carpet, her couture suit now hopelessly wrinkled, staring at the closed boardroom door as if she could magically conjure her husband back through the wood. She looked smaller, stripped of the borrowed authority she had worn like armor for years. But the collapse was only just beginning. My father Thomas finally let the reality of his situation settle into his bones. He slumped against the edge of the conference table, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. The man who had spent 3 decades commanding boardrooms, crushing competitors, and dictating the terms of my life now looked like a ghost. He slowly turned his head to look at me, his eyes pleading. He wasn't the titan of industry anymore. He was a terrified old man facing the absolute ruin of his legacy. Brenda, meanwhile, had reached the breaking point. She didn't bother with her usual grace or social shielding. She simply collapsed onto the floor beside Peyton, her face crumpling into a mask of genuine ugly fear. She reached out, grasping for the hem of my skirt, her fingers clutching at the fabric with a desperate, frantic intensity. "Claire, you have to listen to us," she sobbed, her voice cracking with a high, thin hysteria. "We are your parents. We have given you everything. You cannot do this to us. You cannot bankrupt your own father, and you cannot send your sister to prison. Think about the legacy. Think about the name. Think about the life we provided for you." She was sobbing uncontrollably now, her tears staining my expensive wool skirt. But I didn't flinch. I just looked down at her, seeing the woman who had once stood in my childhood bedroom and told me that my dreams were a waste of time. I watched her play the family card, the final desperate move of a narcissist who had run out of other options. She was invoking our shared history, our shared blood, as if those bonds were a blank check to cover her corruption. "You can't let them take everything." Thomas wheezed, his voice weak and raspy. "I made mistakes, yes, but I did it for the survival of the firm. I did it for all of you." He tried to stand, his legs shaking beneath him. "We can reach a settlement. We can work out an internal resolution. We don't need Sterling Vanguard involved in this. We don't need auditors. Just stop this process, Claire. Please, give us the authority back and we will find a way to make it right for you." The gaslighting attempts were so predictable, so incredibly hollow, that they almost seemed like a parody of our past. They expected me to fall back into the old script. They expected me to prioritize their feelings, their reputation, and their comfort over the cold, hard facts of their criminality. They were still treating me like the teenage girl who would do anything to keep the peace. They were still treating me like the daughter they could manipulate with a well-timed sob or a guilt-ridden lecture about loyalty. I reached down and gently but firmly detached Brenda's hands from my clothing. I stood up, placing distance between us. The distance was physical, but it felt like miles of open space. "You keep talking about the family legacy," I said, my voice echoing in the boardroom, "but the legacy you built was never based on love. It was based on exclusion and deceit." You didn't come to me to apologize for the framing, for the blacklisting, or for the 3 years of misery I endured. You came here to ask for money, and now that the money is gone, you're begging for mercy. I'm not the one bankrupting you, Dad. Your own greed did that. I'm not the one sending Peyton to prison. Her own choices did that. I am simply the person who finally took the ledger out of your hands. Peyton looked up, her hair disheveled, her eyes bloodshot. She didn't try to argue. She just stared at me, a profound, chilling emptiness in her gaze. She knew. She knew the forensic evidence I had presented wasn't just proof. It was a sentence. Brenda crawled a few inches closer, still on her knees, her voice rising in another wave of frantic pleading. We love you, Claire. We always loved you. We just didn't know how to handle the pressure of the business. You're our daughter. You can't destroy us. Tell Nathaniel to stop. Tell him you made a mistake in the audit. Tell him you misread the numbers. I looked at the CEO, who was calmly sipping his coffee, entirely unmoved by their display of emotional violence. I looked back at Brenda. It is fascinating, isn't it, Mom, that you think mistake is a word that can fix decades of intentional abuse. I didn't misread the numbers. I read them perfectly. And that is exactly why you are terrified. You aren't scared of a mistake. You are scared of the truth. I stepped over them, moving toward the door. I didn't feel a shred of triumph, just a cold, heavy sense of finality. The people who had called themselves my family were effectively dead to me long before this morning. They had just finally been forced to confront the corpse. I looked back one last time. The scene was pitiful. Two parents who had traded their daughter's future for their image, and a daughter who had traded her integrity for handbags and casino chips. They were still sobbing, still begging, still trapped in the delusion that someone would come and save them from the reality they had invited. But there was no one left to save them. The era of the Wilsons was officially closed, and the era of the truth had just begun. I left the room without a backward glance, knowing that by the time I reached the lobby, their new world would already be burning. I stood near the boardroom door, my silhouette framed by the harsh hallway lights, staring back into the room. Thomas was still on his knees, his face a roadmap of confusion and shattered pride. Brenda had pulled herself up into the chair, clutching her chest, while Peyton remained motionless on the carpet, her expensive suit looking like a discarded rag. The air in the room was electric with the static of their dying influence. I didn't feel a rush of adrenaline. I felt the slow, steady hum of absolute control. They had spent years refining the art of crushing me, of making me feel like a temporary, unwelcome guest in my own life. Now the tables were turned with surgical precision. I took 2 steps back into the room, my voice carrying that effortless, calm authority that only comes from knowing you hold every single card. You killed this family 3 years ago when you traded my name to protect a thief, I said, my voice cutting through Brenda's sobbing. You didn't just hurt me, you destroyed the moral fabric of this entire company. You turned the most precious thing a parent has, the trust of their child, into a currency for a social status you couldn't afford. Thomas looked up, his eyes watery and red. Please, Claire. Think about the employees. There are hundreds of families who rely on this firm. You'll be destroying their livelihoods too. It was the ultimate cowardice. He was trying to hide behind his staff, using the people he had never cared about as a shield against the consequences of his own choices. I didn't blink. I didn't let the guilt touch me. That is a fascinating argument, Dad, coming from the man who fired me without a second thought when I stood in the way of Peyton's illegal gambling debts. Those families will have a chance to work for a company that isn't rotting from the inside out. I won't call the police. I continued, my gaze shifting to Peyton. Not because I care about you. I won't call them because I don't want to give you the satisfaction of a public trial where you can play the victim. I don't want to stoop to your level of drama and performative misery. I want something much worse for you. I want you to face the silence of the life you built. I want you to live in the quiet rooms of your foreclosed mansion, surrounded by the ghosts of the lies you told to keep your golden child in the spotlight. Nathaniel stepped toward the door, his hand resting on the heavy frame. He was waiting for my final word, his authority now fully aligned with mine. Peyton tried to look up, her expression a mix of hatred and desperate bargaining. But she didn't know what to say. Every word she had ever spoken was a weapon, and now they had all been turned against her. I looked at the folder on the table, the evidence of their fraud now etched into the minds of every board member in the room. However, as the majority shareholder of your debt, I am officially denying your loan restructure and calling in the collateral. I said the words feeling like a physical weight leaving my chest. I had spent years dreaming of this moment, imagining the precise pitch and tone of these sentences. The reality was even better than the fantasy. I wasn't emotional. I was the cold, hard instrument of justice. Your company is bankrupt, I added, my eyes tracking the rapid rise and fall of Thomas's chest. The foreclosure notices for the estate and the corporate headquarters are currently being processed by our legal department. You aren't being forced out by an enemy. You are being evicted by your own bad math. Brenda tried to gasp, but the sound died in her throat. She looked at me not with the anger of a mother, but with the hollow, terrifying realization of a parasite whose source of nutrients had been cut off. It was time to end the performance. I gestured toward the security detail, two men in sharp charcoal suits who had been waiting for the signal. Security, escort these strangers out of my building, I commanded. My voice wasn't loud, but it resonated with the absolute finality of a court order. The security guards moved with robotic efficiency. They approached Thomas and Brenda, first gently, but firmly taking their arms. Thomas tried to stand, tried to pull rank, but his strength failed him. He looked at me, a final look of pathetic, pleading question. Why, he asked. I leaned down so only he could hear me. Because you taught me that business is a man's world, and only results matter, I whispered. You taught me that failing is the only unforgivable sin. You set the rules, Dad. I just decided to play by them better than you. The guards led them toward the door. Peyton was the last to go, her dignity discarded on the carpet. She stood up, her expensive shoes wobbling, her eyes devoid of their usual malice. She didn't look at Jamal's empty chair. She didn't look at my parents. She looked at me, and for a fleeting second, I saw a reflection of the girl I had been 3 years ago, frightened small, and realizing that her family would never reach out to catch her. She walked out. Her shoulders slumped finally, understanding the weight of the shadow she had created for herself. The boardroom door clicked shut, muffling their voices as they were led through the lobby. I remained standing in the center of the room, the master of a debt-ridden empire, finally completely alone. The silence that rushed back into the room was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. I had finally severed the cord, and the world didn't end. Instead, for the first time, it felt like it was truly beginning. The aftermath of the boardroom purge was swifter than any legal counsel could have predicted. Within 3 weeks, the intricate facade that Thomas and Brenda had meticulously curated for 30 years was reduced to a public spectacle. The liquidation of Wilson Manufacturing wasn't just a corporate bankruptcy, it was a societal autopsy. The media had a field day documenting the dismantling of the estate, the public auctions of my parents' luxury vehicles, and the systematic unraveling of their social standing. Every charity that had once clamored for their donations now scrambled to distance themselves, terrified that the taint of the embezzlement scandal would attach to their own names. Peyton didn't stand a chance. Stripped of the protective legal counsel that Jamal had once provided, she was utterly exposed. The IRS moved in with the heavy-handed surgical precision only they could muster. Without the sophisticated, albeit fraudulent tax shielding she had enjoyed under her husband's management, her personal finances were laid bare for federal auditors. She was facing multiple charges of tax evasion, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit embezzlement. Her life of couture and excess had vanished, replaced by the crushing reality of mounting legal bills and a court-appointed public defender who was overwhelmed by the sheer volume of her financial crimes. She spent her days cycling between cramped law offices and the cold, unyielding environment of government interrogations, finally living the reality of the smallness she had tried to force upon me. Thomas and Brenda, once the king and queen of Oakage, had been forced into a humiliating relocation. They had surrendered their colonial estate to satisfy the initial creditors and had eventually moved into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a low-income sector on the far south side of Chicago. The contrast to their former life was jarring. The silence in their new home was not the peaceful quiet of a sanctuary, but the deafening roar of a life built on sand. They were neighbors to the very people they had looked down upon for years, and the irony was a bitter pill that they were forced to swallow daily. My mother Brenda had stopped talking about social status entirely, her energy consumed by the practical, gritty requirements of survival that she had spent decades avoiding. I sat in my new corner office, the one that used to be Nathaniel Pierce's private sanctum. The massive windows offered a panoramic view of the Chicago skyline, a shimmering sea of lights that felt like an extension of my own ambition. My desk was clean, organized, and entirely mine. The days of working in the dark, of scrounging for internet access, and of fearing for my next paycheck were long gone. I reached into the upper drawer of my mahogany desk and pulled out the original letter from Grandma Beatrice. It was worn now, the ink slightly faded, but the words were just as sharp as the day I first read them. I held it for a moment, tracing the letters that had served as the compass for my journey. I had come from a place of absolute disgrace, a blacklisted outcast with no allies and no hope to become the powerhouse executive sitting in the highest chair of the company that once tried to bury me. It wasn't just about the money or the power or the title on the door. It was about the fundamental recalibration of my soul. I had spent years thinking I needed the Wilson family name to be someone. I had spent years equating my worth with the approval of people who were never capable of giving it. I finally understood that true family is the community that surrounds you, the people who have your back when you have nothing left to give, and the mentors who see the potential you didn't know you had. Toxic bloodlines, no matter how deep they run or how much history they claim, must be severed if they threaten the integrity of your own life. The lesson was etched into my history. I had learned that my worth was never and would never be tied to the validation of people who traded their integrity for temporary comfort. I looked out at the city where I had been betrayed and realized it was now the city I dominated. I wasn't the victim of their story. I was the author of my own. I had taken the chaos they created and forged it into a tool for my own success. I had taken their cruelty and turned it into the fuel that drove my career. I hadn't just survived, I had outlasted them. The story is a mirror for anyone who has felt the crushing weight of family expectations or the sting of betrayal from those who should have been their foundation. If you have ever felt forced to shrink yourself to fit into a mold that was never designed for you, know this: your current struggle is the blueprint for your eventual victory. Do not fear the exile. Do not fear the moment the world tries to tell you that you are a failure. The labels others attach to you are merely a reflection of their own fears and limitations, not a reflection of your destiny. Stand your ground, keep your receipts, build your empire in the dark, and when the time is right, step into the light and claim what you have earned. Thank you for listening to this journey of reclamation and triumph. If this story has given you the clarity to reevaluate your own boundaries or the courage to reclaim your path, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of standing up to toxic dynamics. Remember that no one can define your value unless you hand them the pen. Your story is yours to write, and the ending is entirely up to you. The most profound lesson from this journey is that true security is never something you can inherit or receive from others. It is something you must engineer for yourself through absolute self-reliance. For years, I allowed my worth to be defined by a family that viewed my existence as an inconvenience and my success as a threat. I spent my youth desperately seeking their validation, believing that if I played by their rules, I would eventually earn my place at their table. I was wrong. By the time the walls closed in and they tried to frame me for their own crimes, I realized that waiting for their approval was the single greatest obstacle to my own autonomy. The betrayal I faced was not a tragedy to be mourned indefinitely. It was the essential, albeit painful, catalyst that forced me to develop my own capabilities. When they stripped me of my position and my name, I was forced to look into the mirror and acknowledge that my competence as a forensic accountant was a weapon I hadn't yet learned to wield. I learned that while blood ties are accidental, the communities and support systems you build, the found family, are intentional and far more durable. Ultimately, standing your ground isn't about being mean or seeking revenge. It is about respecting yourself enough to refuse the participation in your own destruction. I didn't need to yell or fight dirty to win. I simply needed to hold on to the truth until the lies collapsed under their own weight. My success wasn't built in spite of them, but because I finally stopped looking at them for the permission to exist. If you have ever felt held back by those who refuse to see your potential, share your own story of breaking free in the comments below.